morning, everyone. I am Dante Ang, the President and CEO of the Manila Times. Welcome to the Manila Times Roundtable. We're fortunate today as a guest, Roberto de Ocampo. He goes by a number of other names. Welcome, sir. Sometimes he's referred to Secretary, sometimes as Tiger Bobby, but we know him now as Chairman of the Veterans Bank of the Philippines. Joining us today also is our publishing editor, Ms. Nerilyn Tenorio. Welcome, Neri, back from assignment in Korea. And Arnold Villeza, our executive editor. So, sir, I'll throw the first question to our publisher, the only lady on the table here.
Thank you, Kling. Let's go first to the macro economy situation of the Philippines. What are the prospects now from your point of view, you being also an economist, and are there indications of sustainability, because everybody is really optimistic about the near future, medium term as well, or are there indications that these growth of about 6% will be sustained, or are there any immediate, imminent risks that we face right now?
First of all, let me thank you for inviting me here to the Manila Times and giving me this opportunity to have a discussion with you. There are three basic elements to make an economy prosper. One is stability, the other is growth, and the third is diversification / the creation of job opportunities. When it comes to looking at where we are today, let me start with growth. The growth of the Philippine economy is right now at about 6%. It has been hovering in 6% over the past years, and the only reason it dipped a little bit below 6% 6 months ago is because rice prices went high. But the administration, led by the president, acted on that immediately by having rice importation and eventually the passage of a rice tariffication law, which would stabilize the methods by which we import rice and supplement our domestic production in a manner that would ensure much greater price stability. And the reason that affects inflation quite a bit is because rice constitutes a large percentage of the consumer price index. So once it goes haywire, then you can expect inflation to go up. That was accompanied by the increase in fuel prices because of the Middle East war at that time. Both of those things appear to have stabilized, so at least from the point of view of causing inflation to tick, I don't see that happening in the next 6 months or for the rest of 2019. As a result, you would expect economic growth to be hovering once again in the 6% bracket. The other reason why it should be in that healthy situation is because one of the major reasons for having the economy's growth slow down over the first half of this year is because they took a long time debating the budget, and therefore were not able to pour in enough funds into the economy to continue a very vigorous implementation of build, build, build. Now that's connected to stability because the midterm elections showed an overwhelming vote for the president's program and the president's vision of where the country ought to go. So you could say that democracy is not just about checks and balances and opposition and all that. It is also about having a high degree of cooperation towards an aspired vision for the entire country to move in one direction. So I think that with the Congress and the Senate much more on the president's side, the possibility of their keeping the budget on a dribbling basis is going to be minimized. And as a result, that budget will be able to flow in a manner that will give stronger support to build, build, build. Stability is also happening because most of the population apparently are comfortable and agree with the president's approach to a number of key issues, including peace and order and the prioritization of creation of infrastructure. which brings us to the third element that I mentioned, which is opportunity and diversification. The problem with our economy for the past decades is that while it was showing high economic growth, it was partly because it was coming from such a low point that it becomes pretty high. The analogy is that the growth of a 12-year-old to 14 is much higher than an 18-year-old to 21. And we hadn't reached 18 years old. But the economy's pillars were essentially overseas workers' remittances, and the other one was the growing demand for internet, back office processing, and the like. But you can't keep an economy growing if you only have two pillars.
Okay.
And the overseas workers pillar, while it has been very good and stable so far, is something that you cannot rely upon for diversification. On the other hand, you cannot diversify an economy and create job opportunities if your infrastructure is bad. And the Philippines is one of the lowest in terms of the percentage of the budget devoted to infrastructure. Now, many of you have gone abroad, and so you can see that their airports are nicer, their ports are nicer, their transport system is systematic, and so on down the line, whereas here, it continued to be chaotic and not enough. So the build is an absolutely correct approach to be able to put in a structure or framework in the economy that can create diversification and opportunity. Why? Because if the infrastructure is bad, investors, whether foreign or domestic, will not come in. And if they don't come in, then jobs are not created. If jobs are not created, then you don't have diversification. If you don't have diversification, then your economy becomes, you might say, fragile, because it is open to an event catastrophe. One of the two pillars going down the drain is an event catastrophe. So what's my fearless forecast? For the rest of the year, I expect 6%. For the rest of the year, I expect that programs of build will be even more vigorously pursued. And I expect that the inflation rate will be contained not more than 3% throughout the year. I expect this exchange rate to be fairly stable and not go too far beyond 52/53. And I expect that foreign investment and domestic investment will be quite vigorous. Already you see the Japanese pledging all kinds of funds into this country, but they're not the only ones. The Chinese are doing the same. If you're not seeing much of the same desire from the West, like the US and Europe, it's because they are in tatters. And right now, really the place to look at is Asia. And my other fearless forecast is that it's likely to be an Asian century. And if we play our cards right, we will be positioned quite well in the middle of this growing Asian economic boom.
Wow, that's quite a lot to chew on. Arnold, you want to take off from there?
Yeah, sir. Two things actually, but let's start with you mentioned Chinese loans, and you used to be finance secretary in the Ramos administration. You engineered the country's exit from the IMF program, which was imposed upon us because of the debts we incurred under the Marcos administration. Everybody says now we might have a problem with the loans we are incurring in order to jumpstart the economy, and particularly build, and particularly Chinese loans. Do you think the concern is valid?
First, it's not everybody. I think that a country like us should be receptive to loans and foreign assistance from whatever source. And it is incumbent upon us to negotiate those loans in a judicious and smart way, whether they come from the US or China. part of the reason we got ourselves into problems before had nothing to do with Chinese loans. It had to do with loans from the IMF, from the World Bank, from the United States, and so forth and so on. And we weren't crying our heads off about, aren't we getting ourselves into a pickle?
There's no IMF trap.
There is that trap too. And the trap then, when I was Secretary of Finance, is that it comes with severe conditionalities that sometimes are not relevant to the ability of a country to get out of the trap. Even the IMF learned this during the Asian financial crisis. I happened to be the chairman of the Asian finance minister at the onset of the crisis. And at that time, what was not recognized even by the IMF was that the crisis was different. It was not coming from public sector roots. It was a private sector crisis, and yet their prescription was like one shoe fits all. And they were once again talking about increasing taxes and so forth and so on. And as a result, things got worse. You recall that among the leaders in this part of the world, Mahathir was not quite going along with them, and they were, in a sense, sneering at him. And over the longer term, he was proven right. The Chinese are new in this ballgame, and they are also trying to act like a growing economic power. They have a lot of funds at their disposal, and once a country has that in its hands, it has two things in its mind. One is what you might call spheres of influence. This has gone on for centuries. In the good old days, spheres of influence was implemented by conquering your neighbor. The other, of course, is to prosper your neighbor rather than beggar your neighbor. Because if you prosper your neighbor, the theory is that the entire area becomes one big prosperous market of exchange, and everybody, to continue all these trite cliches, a rising tide lifts all boats. So there is an ideological side to it sometimes, which is, of course, spheres of influence. And then there is the, in a sense, practical side. The practical side for us is to take a look at the different offers of loans for what and make sure, number one, that we're negotiating them properly, and number two, that we diversify our sources, and number three, that the debt burden to the country does not exceed our capability to pay it. Most of the time you hear people thinking that just because you're in debt, the sky is falling. And so you have many politicians saying, oh, let us prioritize, let's not pay our debts and use the money instead. And people like me will say, hey, that's wrong because your credit rating will go down, you still need debt. And sometimes you have to look at debt as an investment. Even if you are an individual and you wanted to get yourself ahead in your job or your life or whatever, you don't have the cash on hand to put all your money into the payment of a car in one fell swoop. What do? You borrow, because you feel that as your income rises, your capability to service the debt on that investment becomes easier, and then you keep going. So the principle is the same even in a country. So I would say that to some extent it is up to us. To another extent, we have to diversify, and to a third extent, because of the ideological part of it, there is this, you might say, tug of war of spheres of influence going on between, in this particular case, of course, the United States and China, and the propaganda can fly thick and heavy.
Sure. Well, for those of us, for those following us on social media, I just want to remind them that the chairman knows what he's talking about. He was the youngest secretary of the Department of Finance when he served as the Ramos administration. This was 94 to 98. The first Filipino awarded the Global Finance Minister of the Year by Euromoney Asia. and also the only Filipino awarded Asian Finance Minister of the Year for consecutive years by Asia Money magazine. But related to what you're saying about China, we're also seeing the United States becoming more inward-looking. Now, it'll be interesting to maybe tap your thoughts about any opportunities, if there are, with the U.S.-China trade war for the Philippines. There's also Brexit that we're seeing and other nationalist movements in Europe. You mentioned that this is Asia's century. Of course, these are the opportunities that you mentioned briefly, but I'm curious, what are the risks that you think that our policymakers would need to navigate?
The risks would be that the trade war goes out of hand in a manner that lowers global economic growth and increases prices worldwide to the worldwide consumers. If I were to just second guess the United States, and in particular President Trump, he's less of a politician than a business negotiator. So he always likes to put the maximum on the table and hope that they will come to some kind of a mid-ground. He did the same with NAFTA. Where now they've junked the old NAFTA, but the other party has come to the table and met. He did the same thing to some extent. It's an ongoing thing, but he's doing the same thing with North Korea. They're not fools, and they realize that this is not just U.S. products versus Chinese products, because the world has gotten to the point where it is a supply chain. China, for example, or even the United States for that matter, is an aggregator of parts that come from different parts of the world. So if you hit, say, Chinese imports into the United States, you're also hitting all the suppliers of the parts that go into whatever it is that you're importing, and so you're going to be affecting even your friends, so to speak. So sooner or later, that will dawn on the U.S., or they're putting a maximum position on the table for negotiating purposes, and in all likelihood, they will come to a mid-ground. Because if they don't come to a mid-ground, then they're toying with fire, and I don't think either one likes to go to the max. In the meantime that this is going on, as they say, when the elephants fight, the ants get trampled upon. What do we ants do about it?
Yeah.
Well, China is looking at being able to prosper their neighbor, and if a market like the United States is temporarily closed, they will probably strategize and see whether or not they can position some of their facilities in other countries. Because if you're being blocked, China direct into, say, the United States, well, if you're putting your facility in some country that's not blocked, then in all likelihood, you're still going, and you knock two birds with one stone. You're able to continue what you're doing at the same time. You're prospering your neighbor. Now, that is an opportunity, I think, that presents itself to us, so that we should be able to continue with our program of increasing opportunities through infrastructure, through open investment policies, to be able to attract this phenomenon. Because, like it or not, Asia is a part of the world which has more than 25% of the entire global population. You just look at 1.2 billion in China, 1.3 billion in India, 700 million in ASEAN, and if that market booms, the West will come running to be able to tap that market as well, which is part of the reason why the Chinese have this Belt and Road initiative. With respect to, on the political side, the U.S., of course, right now is in what I would describe as a prolonged political and cultural civil war. And I don't know how that will end and when it will end. but I think they have bigger problems than over here. In this part of the world, yeah, they can create problems for us, but we can adjust and then continue to build the platform for the future market of this part of the world. The same phenomenon, I think, is what I see with Brexit. The recent European elections, European Union elections, seem to indicate that the idea of having a United States of Europe is becoming a little, or should I say, less and less attractive to many European countries. As a result, maybe the Brits were actually kind of correct when they decided to do Brexit. But let's leave them to their confusion and ask the question, so what do we get out of Brexit? Assuming the Britain continues with Brexit, then one of the offshoots is that their trade relations with their neighbors, etc., will be minimized, and they'll have to take a look at other markets in order to sell their goods. The pound's value will go down from where it is today. But as I was telling some of them, that opens an opportunity for them to tap the markets of their Commonwealth countries, because they were an empire and there's still a lot of countries that identify as being part of the Commonwealth. And then there are other countries like us that are predominantly English speaking that become not only a good consumer market, but a good investment market for them to position themselves in this part of the world, which to my mind will be the Asian century. So I think that just like the US, Europe has got bigger problems than us. And I think they will continue to be in a bit of confused state for a period of time.
So you mentioned earlier, very briefly, about North Korea. How big of a threat is that to this Asian century that we're talking about? It seems that, you know, if this tiny country can throw a proverbial monkey's wrench into all of those optimistic predictions that many people are saying doing this.
A lot of it is being focused on how the United States and North Korea will come to terms.
Okay.
But I don't really think that China itself would want North Korea to misbehave beyond certain bounds. They will allow it to misbehave within boundaries that will make the United States uncomfortable, because that's also part of their strategy, but not to make themselves uncomfortable. So I see North Korea right now actually in a process of evolving towards becoming more and more like, say, Vietnam. I just came from Vietnam, by the way. And
which
even
I think benefiting a lot more from this U.S.-China trade war.
Yes.
At least that's the impression.
And what I
some
meant,
people are.
and what I meant by more and more like Vietnam is because those countries that were formerly communist, looking at China that remains communist, are following a pattern of central political government while loosening the reins on business and private sector in order to create prosperity. And what happens under that situation is that the central government policy allows them to make decisions very quickly. Like, if your transport system is a mess, hey, step aside, we're fixing it. Whereas here, the transport system is a mess. Let's debate about it for the next 20 years. And so they move rather quickly. And I think eventually North Korea will do the same. They will have central government powers and start loosening up on private sector and so forth, which means that they will not be as big a thorn as they presently are.
You mentioned infrastructure quite often, and of course, you know, it's spending a lot on increasing public spending is one thing, but you know, the quality of the spending is another. And you know, if I could just play devil's advocate for a minute, you know, some people might say that the quality of infrastructure leaves some wanting in this government, because For one, many of them will be the type of investment that will be completed by the time the president steps down, and there's really nothing grand or except for the subway that will really extend beyond the term that could be what you can call, I suppose, the transformational kind of infrastructure. I mean, what's your take? Does it matter, or is it just important that the government is spending something?
Quite a lot of the infrastructure that's being built are carryovers
Oh, okay.
from the plans of yesteryears. They're not new.
Okay.
And let me give you a quick example. I happen to have been the chairman of MRT-7
Okay.
at the time of its inception.
Okay.
That inception was round about 1999.
Okay.
The plan there was to divert the traffic of buses from North Expressway by means of a diversion road into a place in Bulacan called San Jose del Monte. And in that area, a big terminal, bus terminal, train terminal, was to be built so that the provincial buses from the north can unload their passengers at the terminal, and the people that will then move from there through MRT-7 going down Commonwealth Avenue into the common station of Shumar Trinoma.
Mm-hmm.
If they want to go to Makati, off they go to MRT-3. If they want to go to Manila, off they go to LRT-1. And a trip that presently lasts 4 to 5 hours will last 45 minutes. 1999. So you can imagine how long we've been talking about that. It's almost the same length of time that it took China to go from Deng Xiaoping to what they are today. And that's how much, and that's how good we waste our time.
Yeah.
But that's not a new project.
Okay.
But it's finally moving.
Okay.
And it will probably be completed within the president's term. Okay. Airport. Okay. Would you believe I am the one that chaired the ad hoc committee created by President Ramos to try to recommend what is the rational way by which we are going to have the new gateways. And at the time, we already said, you shouldn't think of it as just an airport. This is an urban diversification strategy.
Mm-hmm.
You have to move the population outwards, because if you keep stuffing it in here, you'll never solve the traffic problem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the idea was to move the longer range international flights to Clark, build a rapid railway, medium speed, between Clark and Manila, and then start building the community outwards to where it is. Now, my memo was written in 1995. But fortunately, now the ADB is talking about financing the train and so forth and so on, so that might happen. So what I'm saying is that, well, there's also the subway. I just came from Vietnam, and the same Japanese agency for aid is going to build a subway in Vietnam at about the same time that we're building it here. So this is not a pushover project, and it's going, even though it's going to be happening after the president's time, it is still a project that is necessary for urban decongestion. Now, I guess some would criticize that we are using public funds, and why don't we use public-private partnerships instead? And I think part of the reason why we're using public funds is that coffers are filled, whereas during our time we had to come up with a BOT law in order to augment the meager budget that the government has and get infrastructure moving at last. There are some, I have to admit, projects that even I think are a little bit iffy, but fortunately they haven't started it. I don't know if they will, like a railway all around Mindanao, stuff like that. Maybe they have to think about that a little better. But overall, I'd say that the idea of focusing on infrastructure is a long time delayed. It should have happened yesteryears.
I remember during the Ramos administration, the dream was, or the target was, by when we enter the 21st century, we would become we would be at par with Singapore,
One of
tiger
the tiger
economy,
economies.
the tiger economy. 4 administrations later, we are
A paper tiger.
uh,
Not so.
not at that level. So, what do you think went wrong, or what do we need to do?
I go back to what I said earlier about the three things. Right now, the president is at a crossroads. He's got all these positive economic things. He's got effective suasion, let me put it that way, over all three branches
That's a
of
much more eloquent way that he would put it, I think.
over all three branches of government without declaring martial law. And therefore, he is at the crossroads of being able to move this economy forward. Now, this is not the first time we've been in a crossroads. There was a time when we were at the crossroads, but unfortunately,
missed
martial law went in the wrong direction. We were in crossroads before, democracy and all that, but democracy was not combined as effectively as it possibly could with goods on the ground. So now we're at this crossroads. And I think the president has to play his cards right in order to take advantage of both the economic and political opportunities to put into place the elements that will allow us really to move forward. It will take a combination of adept economic strategy, political, what should I say, skill, and political will to be able to make hard decisions when hard decisions have to be made, which is part of the things that were missing in the past. Fortunately, he does have a perception in many circles as being less talk and more action, and that's probably just what the doctor ordered.
Darren?
Another aspect that needs to be looked into is the financial inclusion of the government program for its economic development for this country. How do we go about financial inclusion? And now if we may go into Veterans Bank, what is its role in this
The great
respect?
majority of the Philippine population is unbanked and does not save as much. There are two reasons for that. The first is that the great majority of the Philippine population don't have money to set aside to put in a bank. And the second is that the banking system does not answer a lot of what the majority need, which is why some people would say, oh, how come they borrow from the 5-6 but not from the banks? Why can't the banks do a 5-6, for example? And okay, so the first part has to do with making sure that we have a rising middle class, because without that, people will have no money to put in the bank, so you're up against a wall. A rising middle class occurs, of course, when the job opportunities grow. And so the strategy, which is not really that different from what I was strategizing during my time, is to broaden the tax base rather than keep raising it, so that you encourage the rise of more disposable income, as well as the expansion of the middle class. And you come up, as I said, with infrastructure to provide job opportunities. That is from the macroeconomic side, in order to grow a middle class without which you will continue to have more unbanked, simply because they don't have the money to put in a bank. Now, when it comes to those that have the money to put in the bank, I think right now the BSP is encouraging the utilization of all kinds of technologies to make it easier for most of the people to approach a bank, especially those that find it intimidating. They go to a bank or difficult in terms of what the banks would call paperwork, documentation, so forth and so on. This is being addressed, and the national ID system is one of the elements that would help towards financial inclusion, because when you transact with a bank, one of the things they're going to go through is something called KYC, know your customer, which means who are you, what is your background, and so forth and so on. A lot of which can be shortcut if there was a national ID system. Now that they're finally past one, it would shorten the process, and it would allow the banks to move faster. The second, of course, is that the BSP has allowed you might say, a more liberal spread of bank services. You don't need to have a full-blown branch with all the borloloys in it in order to transact. You can put up a facility that is for the purpose of, say, remittances and deposits. At least those needs of the people, particularly in the rural areas, would be more addressed, and they become more used to transacting with the bank, and before you know it, they move to the next level. So it's an evolution, but those two elements are the key to providing financial inclusion. Now, we in the Veterans Bank like to say that we are our slogan is the bank with a heart for
Sir,
every
I understand.
Filipino.
Your bank is unique in the sense that it's private, but you have a partnership with the government for its.
It's like this. A lot of people think that it's a government bank. It
Yeah.
isn't. A lot of people think that it's a military bank run by generals and so forth. Well, no, it isn't. It is a private bank.
Private commercial bank.
But the reason it has a special niche in the banking community is simply because the entire population wants to recognize the sacrifices that veterans made in order that you and I will exist. Because if they didn't put their lives out on the line, we probably would not be born. So that is a little concession on the part of the government. What is the concession available there? If the veterans have a strong financial institution that they can rely upon, then quite a lot of their financial needs could possibly be met. And unfortunately, over the history of the bank, that wasn't emphasized too well, and the bank closed even at one time in its history. So my role there is to make it a serious banking institution, because if it is, then the veterans have something to rely upon, and the special considerations that were built into it could help the bank achieve its purpose even more. You'll know in our history that many of our veterans had to go begging to the United States for something that they deserved. I mean, enough of that. We can, if we strengthen this bank, not have to go begging. We can have a reliable, continuing source of assistance, not just for the veterans of World War II, who were the original constituency, but all the veterans from here on out.
But I noticed that you, as you said, you've grown beyond that niche. I heard, for instance, that to work for the bank, you had to have a relative who was a veteran, but now that policy has changed. And now I noticed that you are appealing to a
wider
bigger
person,
base, and that you have a role with LGU, local government.
That's in the law.
Yes.
It's not that you have to have a relative, but in the past, because it was dedicated to the main owners of the bank, who are the World War II veterans,
families.
the provision was that if you were to be on the board of the bank, then you should either be a World War II veteran or you should be an immediate heir of a World War II veteran. That continues.
Okay.
But there was an informal rule as well, that the people who were going to be employed by the bank should preferably be, once again, World War II or the heirs of World War II veterans. We continue to apply that principle to the extent possible, because there aren't that many qualified ones anymore, so we're expanding. With respect to the operations of the bank, it's more like a typical commercial bank, except that we do focus on a specific constituency, which have now expanded beyond the World War II veterans and their heirs to all other veterans, and I'm planning to expand it to the entire military establishment.
Okay.
I didn't invent this. There is something, for example, in Thailand called the Thai Military Bank,
Okay.
and its constituency is like, even as they also service the rest of the banking community
Right.
out there. So that is our game plan, and
So yeah.
Do you do you see the for example the direct government assistance to the poor in the form of the conditional cash transfers, for example, that it should continue, or do you think there is a better way of assisting the poor, such as probably increasing the budget for education? Because right now it's been reported over the radio and by the mass media that there's a lot of difficulty in the schools right now being the
Yeah, if
opening
I-
of
Yeah,
classes.
If I may
Actually-
jump in here, because you're a conduit for the 4Ps. So you're in a unique position to maybe change the policy or urge the government to move in a certain direction. Is that part of the agenda?
There will always be, in all societies, a segment of that society that needs special assistance. Right now, the reason why the segment is large is because there's so many that are poor. The strategy of an economy should, to my mind, not be poverty alleviation. In other words,
Okay.
making poverty easier to suffer than otherwise. It should be poverty reduction. And poverty reduction only happens if you create job opportunities. If you succeed in creating job opportunities and you have poverty reduction, then that part of the community that has to be specially assisted with programs like 4Ps continually diminishes. So as a principle, I'd say the thrust of the government, which I think it's doing because of 4Ps and so forth, is poverty reduction. Over time, that program of 4Ps should have a smaller and smaller population, and therefore a lower and lower demand on the budget. And many of those that are presently taking 4Ps, if they have jobs, become taxpayers. And therefore, you would have expanded your tax base, and you would have created even more revenue to modernize the country.
So you are pushing for an increase in 4Ps?
No, I'm
allocation,
not.
or-
I'm implementing what it is today. At the same time supporting the government's efforts towards poverty reduction rather than
But
alleviation.
eventually they have to graduate from it.
Eventually you have to graduate, but how the government places it is something I can suggest to them. If you're asking me, should it be changed into something that is much more, my answer, as I told you, is that there will always be a part of the population that will need that special assistance. And the thing with 4Ps is that it embeds, if it's properly implemented, an education component into it. But what I'm hoping is that the population that draws down from 4Ps would be less and less, or else it will become a dependency mechanism rather than a mechanism to improve livelihood.
So if I were a man on the street consumer, why should I go to the Veterans Bank? I noticed that you have, I'm not sure if this is updated, about 60 branches nationwide. So of all of the banking choices I can make, and you're saying now this is a bank not just for veterans, if I understand you correctly. So why go to your bank rather than other banks? What do you have to offer?
Well, we only have 60 branches,
Right.
so in all likelihood, we're not targeting a massive population
Right.
out there.
Right.
So at this point in time, we are really focusing our efforts on the veteran and military community plus the LGU community. But we are beginning to show them that if you're looking for good, friendly service that is not intimidating and that thinks of you as a person rather than just a
A number.
number,
Yeah.
you come to us. because we are small enough to personalize our approach to you. I've heard this, because some banks are so big that they just give you a
They're
number, or they tell you, oh, you go to that machine and you
Walang
transact.
transfer fees to
No.
that.
And you were mentioning something about the LGU. You said that was in the law. What is the
Yes,
particular
because
role of the variance bank?
because there are only 3 banking institutions in this country that are authorized
That's right.
to transact with the national and local government.
Right.
And these are the Land Bank,
Land Bank,
DBP, and the Veterans
Veterans
Bank.
Bank.
Now, as I said, that was put in the charter of the Veterans Bank by law as recognition of the veterans' contribution to our society. So we do have a lot of LGU
Right.
transactions,
Right.
and we're helping them finance their plans and projects, salary loans, and so on down the line.
And-
So you were saying
Go ahead.
something about being a bank for the military.
Yes, because that is
base,
that is a niche.
Yes, a niche.
Yeah.
But how are you going to compete against those savings and loans associations that offer
There's a-
double-digit interest rates?
It's they specialize in giving high rates and pension, but
That's right.
there is a very wide supply chain that is connected to the military establishment. Okay, even the sewing of patches and uniforms and blankets, that's a supply chain. And so we're looking, when I
Not
say
just,
military, we're not just looking at
the
funding
soldiers themselves.
individual
Yeah, I get it.
veterans. I'm looking at it as a universe that includes a vast supply chain. And that's where a banking institution becomes more appropriate than a savings and loan system.
One last question about the macro picture here. If the Philippines continues to do or play its cards right, how would you describe its role now in this Asian century that earlier you said?
It
we're
could
heading?
be one of the leading countries. There is a study that was done by a third party, an international third party, that even said that the Philippines could very well be among the top 10 leading economies by the middle of this century. Okay?
Of the world or of Asia?
No, of the world. And it combined that with a study saying that the Philippines is in a demographic sweet spot. Now, what does that mean? All the other populations are aging. We're not. In fact, we're supplying the world with a lot of young people. So that the vibrancy of the economy and its insulation from having to muster a very large social security fund for the aged is much less. Just to make this even more dramatic, consider Europe. In Europe, you have a phenomenon that economists describe as an irreversible demographic decline. In other words, the original populations of Europe are in a state where the growth rate of population is below replacement rate to such an extent that even if the God Almighty comes down upon Europe and says, "Go ye and multiply," it will not happen. Okay? But we're still on that, we're supplying the rest of the world. So we've got a big population that speaks English. We've got educated population, and we've got a demographic sweet spot, and we are in the middle of what is likely to become the ASEAN cooperation area with 700 million people, plus trade with a big population of China
Sir,
and India.
your colleague, at that inquiry, Secretary Habitat, saying that we should not be, so, I suppose, comfortable with that demographic sweet spot. and that there are a lot of issues that the government needs to pay attention to, including, as you mentioned, the poverty rate, and that may make the Philippines miss those opportunities.
Mhm.
And I think last week they were talking about 1 million Filipinos out of school.
Mhm.
What's lacking now that the president has this mandate
Mhm.
that you mentioned? He has, in a sense, all of his ducks are in a row.
Mhm.
What's missing to make sure that we don't miss that window, or to use your analogy earlier, what do we do so that we don't miss that crossroads yet again? Because this is an opportunity, but I don't know if we're talking enough we're talking about the right things to
Mhm.
make sure that we capitalize on that opportunity
Mhm.
of cashing in on that
Well, to
on that sweet
some
spot.
to some extent, I've referred to it.
Yeah.
The strategy should always be to try to develop a growing middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a growing middle class if you're creating jobs.
Mhm.
If the president is looking for specific stratagems
Mm-hmm.
to make it happen,
Mm-hmm.
then he might want to consider the development of so-called growth zones.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we tinkered around with this during the Ramos administration.
Mhm.
That's why you have Calabarzon and so forth and
Yes,
so on.
that's right, yeah.
But consider, for example, and it's happening, maybe because they're doing it, a growth triangle that connects Clark, Subic, and Manila. Okay, there's now going to be a railway connecting those three. That growth zone is 10 times bigger than Singapore.
Mhm.
And it has the best airport, that's in Clark. It has the best seaport, that's in Subic. And it's got the center of the country right there. Now, that will disperse the population outwards, create job opportunities, and make that up. Now, you can duplicate the same thing right now. Again, it's happening in the Visayas area with the Iloilo, Cebu, and so forth. So I think that if one were to consider a stimulus type strategy to make sure that the benefits of being a population sweet spot and so forth translate into actual boom,
That's right.
then that's one way to do it. Now, who's doing it that way? China.
Mm-hmm.
They spend a lot of money to create new centers of growth, not only to disperse the population, but also to provide job opportunities.
And the other initiatives that are already in place is, that you mentioned tarification, the rice tarification. Is that so? Because some people are saying that that might impose some difficulties on farmers. There's the package 2 of the train series that's in the Senate now. I mean, your thoughts on those? with this
Good you brought that
particular
up,
issue?
because that only addresses rice. It doesn't address agriculture.
Yeah. Right.
And to some extent, I was happy to see that when the president was in Japan recently, it was reported that he was prioritizing agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Because once again, going back to what my friend Shell said, if you really wanted to use the potential, then you have to look at the comparative advantages in the different sectors of the economy and drive it forward. Now, since I was 5 years old, I keep hearing about agriculture being such a major part. What we haven't really done as much as we could to transform agriculture into higher productivity and move it towards agro-industry, because we are one of the nations with a large agricultural potential that can be the leader in exports of agricultural products if we decided to play our cards in agriculture properly. So I think that aside from saying that agriculture is an important sector, a number of things have to be addressed. For example, we have to figure out how to go from just land distribution to productivity, which may mean reconsolidation in some manner without you might say, disadvantaging the farm
Farmers,
community.
yeah.
But
Because,
can it be the third pillar that you said that might be missing in our?
yeah.
But given the fact that there are more Filipinos now in urban centers than there are in rural centers. I mean,
Again-
is it not yet too late to?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Because we have the land potential.
Okay.
And agriculture doesn't these days doesn't mean lots and lots of people and children plowing fields.
Okay.
If you look at Japan, for example,
Okay.
the same phenomenon occurred in Japan, where people moved out of the countryside towards industrialization, but it was accompanied by higher productivity per hectare in agriculture, so that their per hectare production of rice is even higher than us, even though their land devoted to agriculture is much lower than us. So it's a combination of being able to create jobs in the cities and industry, plus putting in the inputs necessary to make agricultural productivity go up.
Well, does it bother you, therefore, for instance, they're talking about, these additions to the sin taxes, which some say may impose some added difficulties to tobacco farmers. Although, in fairness, there are some who say that there has been enough subsidy to tobacco farmers. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but does it bother you that some of these measures go
Well,
against the very things that
Let
you are
me
saying
put it
should
this
be done?
way. I started this syntax business.
Okay.
Okay, but I'm not the type that wants to drive it to a point where I'm just
That you're
trying
gonna kill industries.
killing the industry.
Yeah.
All right, because like it or not, people are going to look for it,
Yes.
and you might end up in a situation like what happened during the Prohibition era
Yeah.
in the United States.
Yeah.
So after you get to a point of good efficiency on syntaxes, I think one can turn one's attention to other means of raising revenue. Now, for example, I'm really the one that originated the tax reform, remember?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The CTRP, which they're tinkering with, was developed during my time. But the principle behind it was to rely less and less on personal income tax and more on consumer tax or VAT. I don't think we have squeezed enough of the capability of VAT to generate, even at lower rates, revenue that would be more than enough to keep things going, infrastructure and so forth and so on. So I'm with the present administration's idea of having raised the sin tax because, when we did it, it to some extent had a lifespan, meaning to say that you have to tweak it. And of course, there were some that took advantage of the loopholes, so you got to shut down those loopholes. But you cannot keep raising and raising it for the purpose of simply
Otherwise, what will be left to tax?
killing the industry.
Yeah.
Partly because I'm a little bit wary of a prohibition phenomenon,
Right.
and partly because I think there are other taxes that can be generated in order to cover the revenue. And of course, you can shut down smuggling a little more efficiently.
Sure. And you mentioned, again with regard to the package to the tobacco bill, I guess this has been being criticized for some of the inflationary effects that we saw in Train 1, but they say it's actually revenue neutral. But do you see this package to measure as a force that may discourage
Well,
investors, as its critics are saying? Or
First, package one was not really inflationary.
okay.
And in
Because
fairness,
of the timing, I suppose, of the
it's
fuel,
timing.
yeah.
In fairness to my colleagues and friends in
Yeah.
the Department of Finance, they just got hit by that timing.
Yeah.
And of course, nobody likes taxes. When I was doing tax reform, I was getting screams from all sorts of sectors, but you just got to tough it out
Yeah.
and move forward. Now, with respect to package two, as I recall it, the main sticking point has to do with the economic zones.
Yeah, the incentives.
Because the incentives are going to be changed, or at least the manner by which
Rationalized.
you compute the tax is going to be changed. Right now, it is, in a sense, a tax on the top line at a fixed rate. And they were proposing to do it on a net.
Bottom line.
Okay. And that is causing all kinds of consternation. If I were to do it, I'd probably just increase the rate and still tax the gross. Because it's simple. Once you go from gross to net, then to some extent you open the doors to the clever bureaucracy of the BIR to negotiate
Yeah.
your actual payment. All right, and that's and that I think is what's driving some of the debate. Whereas if it's gross, what is there to talk about? You know,
Simple, yeah.
it's there. There's the gross. Here's the rate. Pay the tax. There's nothing to assess.
No manipulation.
There's no, yeah.
Yeah.
Di ba usually they'll assess you big time, and then you start.
Then pag-usapan na lang.
But in this particular system, well, yeah.
Well, there's really so much more to talk about, but I really appreciate your time with us. I just want to remind some people who are following us online that if they want to read more about Chairman Ocampo, the Manila Times did feature him in the Sunday Times magazine last year. We dug this up for you, and I'm glad to hear that your friends at the Management Association as well.
No, the SGV.
SGV had also published a book compiling many of your works. You know, it's been a pleasure talking to you this morning about a variety of things, and if you don't mind, we'd like to have you over again,
Sure.
maybe on another occasion, to talk more about the economy and your industry. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'd be happy
you, sir.
to come back. Thank you.
Okay. Wrap. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Was that interesting enough?
Oh yeah.
Thank you, sir.
I think the challenge was to
Thank you.
keep it to a few topics.